Joining me now for the latest on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and how today is being marked by many communities across the country is Metis National Council President Cassidy Caron. Hi, President Caron. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much for having
me. Let's just begin with today, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Obviously, only the second time that today has been marked in the history of Canada and the history of Turtle Island. What do you make of the various events and the various community events that are taking place across the country?
So I'm just leaving an important event in the community of Isle La Crosse, Saskatchewan. And Isle La Crosse is a really old Métis community here in northern Saskatchewan. And there was a boarding school, a residential school here in Isle La Crosse that almost 7 generations of Métis families went to. And it continues to go unrecognized by federal, provincial government, as well as the Catholic Church did to our communities and to our families and to the Métis Nation as a whole. And so, you know, these events are really important to continue to raise awareness about the truth of the history of Canada, as well as to continue fighting for the recognition that our survivors so badly deserve.
And how can we go about educating people on what needs to be done to ultimately achieve reconciliation?
There's so much. There's so much that needs to continue, that goes beyond just one day, that goes beyond just the one day that's dedicated to reconciliation here in Canada. There's multiple reports that document all of the harms that have been done and continue to be done to Indigenous people here in Canada, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, the inquiry report on murdered Indigenous women and girls, the recent Senate report on sterilization of Indigenous women. It's really important that Canadians take time to read all of this work that's been done to document these stories, to document what's happening in Canada, and continue to raise awareness, continue to fight for systemic change so that we can all live in this country and prosper and be healthy and happy and live just as our families and our ancestors would have wanted us to before colonization.
And I guess just lastly, before we conclude, when you look specifically at younger people, obviously, you know, people who were a part of the residential school system when they were a part of that system were young people. Today, Orange Shirt Day, many people across the country wearing orange shirts to honor those survivors of residential schools. How can we go about having these types of conversations with young people in a way that perhaps we're not giving them too much detail, but I guess a way that they're also understanding what's going on?
Great question. And I think young people today, there's so more opportunities about opportunity to in our school system, opportunities to listen to elders, keepers of communities that might be across the street from those.
Cindy Blackstock is Executive Director of the Family and Children Caregiving Society, and she joins me now to reflect on National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, only the second time that this day has been marked here in Canada. Cindy, thanks so much for making the time.
Well, thanks for having me, Wyatt.
What do you make of how the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is being marked today across the country, and, you know, the various community events that are happening in various communities across the country?
Well, I think it's just wonderful to see people of all diversities out learning about the history of Canada in relationship to First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples, and celebrating the diversity of First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples today. When you look at residential schools, Wyatt, as you know, for many, many years, the Canadian public was not educated about those schools. Now that people are coming to know what happened, they have the opportunity of learning from history to address some of the contemporary injustices to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and to build a better country for everyone.
When you look at how obviously students who attended residential school who had their culture and their way of life taken away from them, they were young people at the time. What do you make of how we should be educating young people now about these injustices that happen and about the tragedy that was the residential school system? And how do you balance it being too much information, giving young people, younger students in this case, versus the information that they absolutely should know about?
Yeah, you know what? It's a really good question. And we have been working with a group called the Project to Heart for many years, Wyatt, where teachers, skilled teachers, have been working to educate youth of all ages about residential schools, but then to say how you can actually take action today. What do we have to learn from history so that we can take action today on things like murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls? The research shows that the kids actually feel more empowered by knowing the truth. They sense something's gone wrong. So it's better to tell them the truth in age-appropriate ways and then give them the tools to be able to address it. And let me give you one example. When people saw the children from unmarked graves, a lot of Canadians said, well, this horrible thing with residential schools must have happened because people back then didn't know any better. Or if they did know any better, there weren't enough tools to deal with it. Well, today we unveiled a plaque in honor of Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, who was a medical inspector for the Indian Department. 100 years ago today, Wyatt, he released a report called A National Crime that detailed the unequal healthcare funding for Indian children and the terrible health practices in the schools, which were resulting in death rates of about 50% of students. Now, Dr. Bryce is one of many people who blew the whistle. And I think when we look across the history of residential schools, we learn that people of the period back then did know better. There were people like Dr. Bryce and others who were resisting the injustices. There were solutions to save the children's lives. And the public, when headlines would come out about Dr. Bryce's report, were horrified. But when the headlines died, children did too. So public pressure is really key to achieving justice.
So public pressure is key to achieving justice. But when you look at, I know you as an example were very involved in the beginning of 2022 to I guess, leading the charge to ensure that survivors could receive compensation. When you look at certain things such as that, what do you make of how far we have come in the journey towards reconciliation and how far we still have to go?
Well, when I was growing up, I was born in 1964. Actually, today is my birthday, Wyatt. And when I was growing up, there was nothing about residential schools. And so people were really suffering in silence. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples felt that they were left alone. I think seeing the sea of people who come out on Orange Shirt Day really sends a message that we're not alone anymore. That this generation of children is not alone, the survivors are not alone. But that in and of itself is not enough. We have to press for the remedying the injustices of murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls. That report's been on the books for 3 years and not enough has been done. We have to also address the ongoing inequalities in First Nations communities. There's still kids who don't get clean drinking water or don't get proper funding for education. And then the other thing we need to stop is the government of Canada, in the name of Canadians, is litigating against residential school survivors from St. Anne's Residential School, where they literally had an electric chair. So we see politicians sometimes going out and wearing orange shirts, but what they also need to be doing is taking action and stop the injustices that are happening on our watch.
Okay, Cindy Blackstock, Executive Director of the Family and Children Caregiving Society. Cindy, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me, Wyatt.
Thank you. NDP MP Lori Idlout is the NDP's Shadow Minister and critic for Crown Indigenous Relations and Indigenous Services, and she is with me now. Lori, thanks so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Wyatt.
Obviously, today I'm sure is a very emotional day for you and for many people across Turtle Island. Why don't we just begin? What are you thinking about on this second day for Truth and Reconciliation?
In the second anniversary of September 30th with Orange Shirt Day, I'm definitely thinking of all the survivors, their families, and how it has to be a time of reflection and a time where we need to take extra care and love when we're talking about the impacts of residential schools in Canada.